Carla, your research into probation approved premises has found that some sex offenders not only meet together regularly but also encourage one another to reoffend. It becomes the topic of their conversation. This is obviously a problem because they're not meant to be in that situation to do that. How do you see this problem being overcome? What needs to happen?
I think the first thing that needs to happen is that the staff who actually work in the hostel itself need to recognise that this is happening and it is a problem that's occurring. At the moment, by and large, obviously there are individuals who work there, but by and large the staff see this happening but don't recognise the significance of it, the implications that it's having for those individuals that are grouping together, that are talking to each other, encouraging themselves to still be sex offenders. So the first thing is that they need to recognise that, and that's going to be that's a training issue, that's a training programme for those staff. So that's obviously got resource implications, but it can be part and parcel of their broader training programme that they have to go through anyway. The second thing I think that needs to happen is some structural considerations about how these these hostels can work with these offenders and actually how that can be best managed, and this is where further research would be needed, where they're either broken up amongst other offender populations so that they're not able to group together so effectively because there's less of them to talk to. But the problem with that is there's not that many hostels around. Across the entire country is only just over 100. So you have to prioritise who goes there, and of course there's a high proportion that are sex offenders goes into them because they are considered in need of this level of support and supervision when they're coming out of prison. So that's a difficult thing to do, but we can do it to some extent, more so than we're doing now probably, especially if you think about moving hostels so that they're sited away from places that we don't want to put sex offenders, so away from schools, away from play parks. Some of them are currently situated near those places and therefore won't take sex offenders. So if we think about where we're putting them so they can take a full range of offenders, that'll help. The other thing we can think of doing is actually deliberately grouping them together, but knowing that we're doing it in order that we can influence those relationships, and the staff that are working with them can influence them more in a much more intensive way. So we're actually doing it deliberately and managing and manipulating those groups to our own ends.
And which do you think would work best, or do you think they both should work in tandem with one another?
The latter is much more resource intensive because you'd have to have very well trained staff, you'd have to have a much higher level of staffing to resident population. So it's probably, but we have used it in the past in therapeutic environments, therapeutic clinics, and also within some settings within therapeutic prisons, with good results, that have come out well results, but it's very expensive. So for the highest risk offenders, that might be a good way to go. But for those who aren't so high risk, the other option probably be the best, where they're more scattered amongst the rest of the population. And
one organisation that you feel could help you is an organisation called Circles UK.
Yes.
What do you feel that they could bring to the table?
Circles UK oversee the Circles of Support and Accountability, which is this organisation of volunteers who will take a high-risk sex offender coming out of prison, an individual, and there's a group of volunteers who work with them to help them resettle back into the community. Research is showing that this, early research in the UK, but quite established research in other countries, especially in Canada, is showing that this works very well. It's very good in helping an individual resettle and not offend, but it's also very good in us, as in terms of the criminal justice system and Circles UK themselves, finding out if a person is dangerous and likely to reoffend and doing something about it before they do reoffend, if that might mean sending them back to prison. We don't do that with people in hostels. We do it if they might go into a hostel after prison, and then when they leave the hostel, they might have a circle. But they don't do it with them in prison. And I think what we could do is bring that circle model, if not Circles UK itself, into the hostel situation. And even perhaps within prisons, it could be part of a transition through this system rather than something that they do once they've left prison. And I think that will help break up those groups, but will also give sex offenders in that situation, coming out of prison, a strong social network, a support network, and positive role models that they can talk to and be encouraged to behave in different ways than they are currently. And that's why I think they'd be so useful.
And do you see further research being done in this area?
The circles themselves in the community
setups
are being very successful, and they're being rolled out across the country, and there's more and more of them developing all the time. So whilst that's happening, so the idea of them branching out, expanding into these new areas, is something that could happen as part of that growth of them. So I think that would be a really important area to have research around, to see how effective they are and how that's operating, and how that can be better supported maybe through criminal justice or government policies perhaps. So there's a real area there of further research to explore that, as well as how sex offenders themselves, how do they break away from these sort of pro-offending contacts that they have? How do they relate to other people? And it's quite challenging for them to be part of these groups who are being quite challenging with their behaviours, their attitudes, and we need to make sure that we support them so that they stay engaged in that process, because if they don't stay engaged, then it's not going to work. So we need to help that too. We need the research there.
The University of Huddersfield, inspiring tomorrow's professionals.